At the far reaches of the Liquor Forest lived an old and decrepit woman in a rundown cabin. The people of Pom Pom Village held a great fear of this woman, believing her not only to be a witch, but one who also worshipped demons. This woman, being an outcast, only had one true friend, a familiar that roamed the forest. This familiar had the appearance of a male deer, but with long, twisted horns. This creature would accompany the woman wherever she went. This familiar was very protective of the old woman. When they would venture near the village, the local children would throw stones at the woman, which enraged the deer. It could see the malevolence in them, more so the wickedness that the parents instilled in them. The children were spoiled and ungrateful, but it knew the parents were the root cause of this. On one cold winter day, the familiar's rage came to a boil. A small girl took a long stick and used it to poke at the old woman. It stuck her eye, causing the woman a great deal of pain, which sent the familiar into a frothing anger. The small girl, becoming frightened of the creature, ran from it. The familiar chased her through the woods, quickly catching her and pinning her against a tree with its horns. It tried to do unto her what she had done to the woman. One of the adults had seen this transaction and yelled for help. Before the familiar fled into the forest, it slashed the girl's face. Once she was back in the hands of the fellow villagers, she lied to them, telling the adults that the woman had sent the deer to attack her. Outraged by this news, the villagers raided the forest. After finding the woman's cabin, they began to set it ablaze. The strongest men held down the buck as it watched the old woman's house burn. The familiar could hear the old woman scream from inside the inferno. This sent the creature into a frenzy. Finally breaking free from the men, it began attacking them. The deer mauled many of the villagers before attempting to find a way to save the woman in the fire. More of the men grabbed the deer and wrestled it to the ground. One produced a knife and began skinning it. After an excruciating process, the familiar's skin was sheared off and the rest of its body thrown into the burning ruins of the cabin. The villagers returned to the town and hung the pelt as a trophy. Several weeks later, one of the girls in the village, the daughter of a baker, was transfixed with the fur, wanting to make clothing out of it. However, she knew the villagers would never sell it to her, nor did she have the money to even consider buying it. She knew she would have to steal it. As night fell, the moon rose, and she snuck her way through the town to the main hall, where the fur was hung. Once inside, she took the pelt off of its stand and quickly escaped. As she entered her house, in her excitement, she clumsily knocked over a jar of expensive chocolate, shattering the jar and spilling the sweet liquid all over the fur. The noise from the jar shattering woke the girl's mother. Finding the girl in the kitchen, having spilled the expensive chocolate and stolen the fur, the mother was furious. So much so, she threw the girl outside into the snow. The girl, now alone in the cold, with only the fur to keep her sheltered, ventured out into the woods. The thick snow and the blasting cold wind proved to be too much for the girl. She collapsed into the frozen ground, quickly being coated in a layer of snow, her body wrapped in the fur. And there she died. The night after, the chocolate that had frozen onto the fur began to bubble. The viscous liquid began to engulf the fur, as well as the deceased young girl within it. The entire mass began to take form, The visage of the familiar began to arise, though its once strong and large form was now weak and small, mimicking its host. As the body of the deer was near completion, strange human-like limbs sprouted from its back, arms and legs whose smaller appendages twitched and moved. At last, the chocolate began to grow from its head in long, slender forms. Once hardened, the deer now had a large set of horns. The familiar was overtaken by a sense of revenge, which led it back to the little girl's house. It bashed through the door, wreaking havoc within the bakery. This drew the mother back to the shop room, witnessing the destruction. Before she could retreat from the monster, it pinned her to the wall with its horns. The mother pleaded for her life, but the creature saw the corruption in her, the wickedness that was in many of the villagers. It remembered how they tortured and skinned it, how they burned its only friend alive in her cabin. It had no compassion left. The familiar pierced the mother's heart with one of its horns. As her body lay limp on the floor, the deer was overcome with an insatiable hunger. The familiar skin began to liquefy, the chocolate dripping onto the mother's lifeless body. It quickly learned what to do. It laid on top of her, letting its whole form melt and encase the mother's body. The chocolate mass bubbled and squirmed. Within seconds, its deer body began to reform, but larger now, having consumed more mass. More limbs sprouted from its back as another body was taken into it. The deer fled the bakery and disappeared into the nearby forest.